everybody is really interested in understanding what it can do. We've had a number of conversations with our membership around how can it be applied. And I think you see a number of folks using it at a very bare bones kind of perspective right now, maybe using it.
Ken Klug, welcome to the podcast. Really a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you.
And for those joining us here, I wonder if we start with a little bit about what you're up to now, what's your current role. Maybe tell us a little story of how you got here too.
Yeah, for sure. So I am currently the president and CEO of QCS Purchasing Cooperative. So we are a cooperative member-owned buying group in the food and beverage industry. I've been here about a decade now. And prior to that, I had worked at Kraft Foods and I had worked in the chemical industry for several years. So it was kind of a unique opportunity for me. In my first role, it was all business to business. And then when I moved into the food and beverage industry, started working a lot more with kind of the consumer facing products. So it's been kind of a unique blend, which really was a great fit when I got into this purchasing cooperative space.
Oh, that's really cool. So just out of curiosity, what was your background in the chemical industry? What were you doing there?
Yeah, so I started out in supply chain. I'm a big fan of understanding how things work. So I did everything from customer service to logistics, obviously a lot of materials management, transportation, purchasing. I had a really great career. Pretty much every 18 months, I was moving into something new, and it was a great learning opportunity for me.
That's really cool. So let's talk about where you are now. The thing that really intrigued me about your role is the ability to see into a bunch of different companies through your members of your organization or your co-op, and probably start to see some patterns. So I'm curious, as we're talking about the topics I'm really interested in, how people are using technology to drive what is ultimately their business goal to grow and change the company and, getting competitive edge, et cetera. I'm curious for you, what do you see as those patterns happening in your member orgs about challenges people are having and what they might be doing about it?
Yeah, so there's a number of different things going on in the industry right now. We're really reaching a really fascinating point with the inflationary pressure, right? I think folks are really frustrated over how much it costs to go grocery shopping. Mm-hmm. I think if we all look at our bill pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, it's absolutely crazy how much pricing has gone up. So there's a lot of pressure right now on the members of our cooperative to deliver better pricing to the retailers, right? So you probably saw, I think in May, almost every major grocer announced some sort of change in their pricing, right? That they were announcing lower prices. I think Aldi said something like, hey, we're lowering the price on over 250 food items. And then Target followed suit just a couple days later, right? So there's a lot of pressure on these manufacturers to improve their pricing. And so when you look at it from a technology standpoint, really understanding what product profitability are and is and where the products are selling, which products are selling is absolutely crucial. But there's also a lot of things behind the scenes from an operations perspective. And that's really where we play a great deal in when it comes to purchases. So the use of data right now is absolutely a huge, huge thing for a number of the companies that we work with, really trying to get their arms around their purchasing patterns, right? And for many of them, that begins with invoice automation, right? So first, as those invoices are coming in, collecting those invoices, aggregating those invoices, and as those invoices are processing through their respective ERP systems, then mining that data and cleaning that data so they have an accurate representation of the things that they're buying and understanding, purchasing patterns like, hey, if I buy a truckload instead of multiple partial trucks, obviously there's a savings there. Yeah. So I think that's a big thing that we're seeing, from a trend perspective on our end.
That's interesting. So a couple of questions. So the one is, I only know a little bit about the kind of the grocery space, but the one thing I feel like I remember from talking to someone is that it's a pretty tight margin industry, something like 5% or something like that. And so I imagine that, a lot of times, so the grocer is probably saying, well, we're not changing anything. Let's push this downstream to the vendors. Absolutely. Is that kind of what's happening? So the pressure is for your group to innovate on, okay, fine. Well, if they're not going to change, we have to find a couple of points here and there. Is that kind of the the pressure?
That's exactly what it is. So it's fascinating for us because it starts with the retailers, right? And they start putting the pressure on the food and beverage manufacturers, and those are our members or our customers that we work with. So we sit down and talk with them about, okay, hey, if you have to deliver a couple of points to this major retailer, here's some areas where we can do it. And you go through the traditional strategic sourcing process, right? You look at the levers that you can pull. And one of the things, obviously, as a cooperative, we're able to aggregate all of their volume and leverage that with the supplier community.
Yeah.
But it's also forced us to be more innovative in that we have to sit down and look at the ways in which they're purchasing, who they're purchasing from. A lot of that consolidation, it may mean that they have to buy from a different supplier or a different company that they've normally not worked with.
Yeah.
And it's been interesting, and it's only just started, right? I think most of these retailers made these announcements in May. So they lowered their pricing, and then the next week they told all the manufacturers, hey, now you need to give me a better price or you're not going to be able to sell to me.
To what extent does the size of the company play into this? I feel like, trying to be more efficient, trying to bring data in, trying to, use EDI and all these sort of more advanced technologies is something like probably the medium and big guys can do no problem, but mom and pops are trying to figure out how in the world we're going to do this. Is that right?
Absolutely. 100% correct. I think, we're fortunate that, you have a lot of new technologies like ChatGPT, for instance. Yeah. It was fast. A lot of the members that we work with are in the 50 to probably $250 million in annual revenue size. So from that perspective, they don't have a great deal of funds often or a lot of experience to go ahead and dig into those kinds of things from a technology standpoint. So they really come to us to kind of give them some guidance on, well, what do we do? How do we combat this? When you've got this major retailer that has billions of dollars of sales coming to a $52 million family-owned small company, how do you compete with that? And so, we've referred them to a lot of different technology providers that they can work with. And, and we're learning too. That's the benefit of being part of a cooperative. We work with some 800 different companies. So you're always out on the road visiting, learning, oh, hey, if this is working for you, now I can take this over here, copy, paste, and share it with somebody else.
Well, so you mentioned like your mind went first to invoicing and kind of efficiencies there. Yeah. What are some of those other wins you've seen as you've been traveling around and working with companies?
Yeah, so I think the invoicing was obviously the first one, right? When you're in a procurement role, you really want to understand what your spend details are and get your arms around that. So I think that was one of the first things that a lot of them employed. It's fascinating, though, how many of these small and medium-sized businesses are run on Excel. That's one of the interesting things that you see, right? If you're able to get your hands on that data, report on it, you dump it into Excel, you pop it into pivot tables. A lot more people are using, simple Microsoft Suite applications like Power BI now, right? Where they're putting the data in there, building reports so that, hey, I upload the data, I've got something from a dashboard standpoint that I can look at that's giving me more insight into my business. So I think a lot of that kind of reporting is definitely out there. A lot of the standard ERP kind of solutions that folks are looking for too, right? I think that's a big thing, whether it's something like an SAP Business One or a JD Edwards kind of thing. There's a lot of people exploring that kind of stuff too.
And also, talk a little bit about what the organization does in terms of like a buying group. I imagine that has some downward price pressure, which is probably why they want to be a part of it. So how does that factor into this whole equation?
Yeah. So, in terms of what we do, we are able to supply a lot of that data too. So from our perspective, we run on an ERP system. As we're paying those invoices, we're able to see trends across the regions, trends across the nation. And we're able to sit down and say, okay, well, hey, if this commodity pricing is 15% higher over here, why? And be able to leverage that data set and dig into it a little bit further and, leverage that with the supplier community to negotiate better.
What kind of pressure does changing weather and difficulty like getting the product in the first place, does that come into play yet, or where does that sit for you?
Yeah, absolutely. We follow a lot of the major commodity markets. So, we are one of the largest buyers of corn syrup in the country. That's used in a lot of, sweetener applications. So we're absolutely watching what's going on in the corn market. We are a big buyer of OJ. A lot of the beverage manufacturers that we work with are buying bulk loads of OJ. If you've ever seen the old movie Trading Spaces, that's exactly what we do is, kind of watch what's going on in the OJ market and, you know, try and hedge against the risks from not from a geopolitical, but more from an environmental perspective.
Okay.
What's going on in the weather and what are the crop reports going to be.
Is your focus mostly the Americas, or are the pressures from overseas that have any impact? Tell me about that dynamic.
Yeah, so for us, we are pretty exclusive to North America. The bulk of our membership is in the United States. We do have a handful of members that we work with in Canada, but where the international business really comes in is there's a lot of importation, right? You think of sugar imports, even back to the juice imports. And one of the things that we get involved with quite a bit as well are things that a plant needs from an operations standpoint. So think gloves, hairnets, boots, that kind of thing. And a lot of those were coming in from Southeast Asia. So if you look back to the pandemic days, right, that really disrupted the supply chain pretty dramatically. And one of the things that we saw coming out of the pandemic as we went through that major supply chain disruption kind of a year or two after the pandemic was a lot of nearshoring of sourcing, right? Where a number of members would say, hey, that's great that you can get me a lower price on hairnets, but I really need to make sure that I get the hairnets, because if you get me a great price on something that they can't deliver, that doesn't do me any good whatsoever, right? So it's been fascinating from our perspective. You see a lot of transition where we're moving away from importation to trying to identify local sources where maybe the price is a little bit higher, but the security of supply is a lot stronger. Yeah. And, that definitely plays into it. And, and I think that will for several years. We're going to continue to see more and more production kind of bouncing back and forth between different regions around the world.
That's interesting. How about what about any sort of consumer, like changes in consumer behavior, what people buy, what people want? How does that impact your industry?
Yeah, so there's a number of different things. Generationally, it's been very interesting to see the change in the generational focus when it comes to products. There's this younger generation. I've got a couple of teenagers at home, and they're more interested in where the product is coming from, how the product is made. A lot of that sustainability. A lot of the fair and ethical treatment of, where those products are coming from. Yeah. So there's definitely a change that you're kind of seeing from, that generation. Overall, we deal with a lot of dairy, we deal with a lot of beverage, and of course, they're under a lot of pressure from a sugar content perspective as well. So you continue to see a lot of innovation there in terms of sugar substitutes. A lot of different products being rolled out that still have a lot of sweetness to them, but maybe don't have the calorie impact as a traditional sugar might. Yeah. So, yeah.
What's your take on how soon any sort of electric self-driving truck is part of the supply chain? How have you made preparations for that? Have your members, what are people's thoughts about that, and what's the time frame?
So, a lot of the folks that we work with tend to be slow movers when it comes to, major technology, things like that. I think everybody's kind of cautiously watching. We saw one of the large beer manufacturers move to the autonomous self-driving trucks, and I think there's a lot of interest in it if it works, right? If it works, right? And I think everybody's kind of waiting to see the proof, right? Is it going to work? Is it going to be safe? Is there any liability associated with not having a driver behind the wheel? So, they're definitely more of a slow mover when it comes to those kinds of technologies, but there's definitely an interest, right? I mean, you've seen diesel pricing all over the place the last couple of years. And if you can control your costs and contain them a little bit and make them a bit more predictable, there's a lot of interest in having predictable, reliable costs.
Yeah. So I feel like it's at least worth examining kind of what's happening with AI in this market. You mentioned a little bit of people using ChatGPT for something. I'm curious, what else have you seen? What's been successful that you're aware of in that space?
Yeah. So from an AI perspective, everybody is really interested in understanding what it can do. We've had a number of conversations with our membership around how can it be applied. And I think you see a number of folks using it at a very bare bones kind of perspective right now, maybe using it to create job descriptions or create sales plans or social media campaigns, right? I think there's a lot of interest in that. I actually visited a member 2 weeks ago that was dumping his production schedule. He said, okay, here's all the products, here's my inventory, here's everything that I have available from a raw material perspective, here's the number of hours I have. And he was dumping it into a AI tool to kind of come up with his production schedule with pretty decent success. So I think everybody is kind of in this experimental phase, trying to understand where it can best be used, right? I know it seems to be a lot more on the creative side, more from a marketing and sales side. You see it being used, but I definitely think there's a ton of opportunity within the supply chain as we move forward. We're actually exploring it with our invoice processing as well, just trying to layer that into what we're doing from an EDI perspective and, allowing it to catch some of those exceptions and help, propose solutions to some of those exceptions. And we see an opportunity to leverage it with the data analytics that we were talking about earlier in the future as well. Identifying those trends.
What's the area if you were to give advice to kind of some of your members or other people kind of in that size range, what are the areas you think are the most fertile for experimentation for that kind of thing? Because I think you're right. I see a lot in marketing and kind of content generation, which is super interesting, but not always really tangible in terms of real value. What you're talking about, kind of dumping in a schedule, I feel like for the LLM conversation or the ChatGPT stuff has really sucked the air out of what is kind of the rest of AI, which is all actually developing real models and like really kind of bespoke things tailored to. And it's a balance because the LLMs are so accessible and kind of so cheap, but yet you do have to kind of check their work, so to speak. And that's kind of an interesting balance. So like, what do you see out there?
Yeah. So from our perspective, we're definitely encouraging people to explore it. It's fascinating because a lot of times we'll visit with one of the members and we'll stumble across something that seems to be a fit for everybody. But right now, there's just, to your point, there's a number of different options out there that people are exploring, that people are kind of playing with. Yeah. And from our perspective, we just want to continue to encourage that because I think the analysis of data, it's so strong at that. And, when you look at some of these smaller organizations, they have a ton of data that they're not doing anything with at all.
Right.
And that's where you see some of these big, like Amazon, right? I mean, you think about the amount of data that Amazon has and how they analyze it and how they utilize that to come up with the new products that they roll out through like the Amazon Basics or what have you, right? And I think a lot of these small mom and pop food and beverage manufacturers, they've got similar access to data. They just don't know what to do with it. Right. And I think, and when I say data, I mean everything from sales and marketing all the way down to the gentleman I was talking to about production schedules, right? I mean, or even just your employee work schedules, or there's so many aspects of it. And I think you're going to see a lot of technology companies coming out with a consultative arm or a consultative solution to help these folks really navigate all these different tools that are out there and really identify what's the best fit for them. Because
there's so many options and so many things you can do. And one of the things that I find when we work with clients is too often the objective is let's use AI as opposed to let's solve a problem or let's achieve an outcome you're going for. And then so we go around doing all these experiments and you don't have a good way to prioritize because there's no real strategy around, well, what should we actually be focusing on? Like to your point, if we can fix invoicing, our time to cash shortens, our ability to do the X, Y, and Z changes, that's a problem we're solving. If it's just like, let's make more emails, it's kind of not as good at,
Yeah, we had that conversation the other day. I don't want my team to be excellent at responding to emails. I mean, that's
right.
That's not moving the business forward. That's not creating value for our members. I mean, let's try and invest that time, that energy, that technology somewhere else. And I think a lot of people are looking for someone to say, hey, this is how you can use it and help them create that strategy, right? Because I think everybody, if they really understood the capability of AI and what it can do, I think it would be a whole lot easier to create that strategy. But I think it's the old analogy of drinking from a fire hose. There is so much information and unfortunately misinformation out there on what AI can and can't do that you've got analysis paralysis, right?
Yeah. Well, so I'm curious what your advice would be on this. So for me, I always say, like, if you're not sure, like, go and look at, like, document your process, see where you think the really big inefficiencies are, where the high dollar values are, and then work on those. Like, what would you recommend to people as a way to put your toe in the water without wasting a lot of time and effort?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, one of the things that I'm a big proponent of being part of a cooperative is I call it shamelessly stealing from other people, right? Or researching, really leveraging a peer group to understand what they are doing and what they aren't doing. I think that is immensely powerful. Being able to talk to somebody that is doing something that you're not and learning from it, and vice versa, sharing the things that you're doing. And that's one of the things that I encourage. So many people operate in a vacuum or try and research things. They go on YouTube and try and search for videos on it. And so much of the information that's out there is not specific enough to what they're doing as an organization that it really makes so much more sense to work with somebody that's a peer, to understand how they're leveraging it. So, I'm absolutely with you in terms of the process documentation. That's critical, right? You to figure out where you're trying to go, you got to understand where you are. So I think process documentation is huge. But I think, in a situation like this where there's just so much information out there and so much uncertainty on how to leverage a technology like this, I think, networking with peers is a huge opportunity.
I like that. So maybe a final thought. You said you've been in your current role 10 years. So what's the advice you would have given to your 10 years ago self that if you'd known now would have been a big difference maker?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm a big fan of relationships, just kind of like I was just sharing. I think there's a lot of relationships that I built early in my career that I wish I had kind of maintained. Some great mentors that really taught me a lot, that took me under their wing, that I've lost touch with over the years, that, I think I could reciprocate and return the favor in a lot of ways. So, for those young people starting out, it's so important that you make those connections, you make that professional network. It's a different group of people than your friends, right?
Yeah.
You always have to have friend group. It's important. We're social beings. You got to have that, but you also need to have that professional network too. And whether it's a peer group or it's just a matter of making a reminder in your calendar to stay in touch with somebody, it's so important that you keep those relationships fresh and healthy.
That's such a great idea. And I feel like you're reminding me of a time I was at a training with about, 25, 30 other people. And this exact topic came up. And the trainer told us over a break, hey, listen, we were just talking about these people you hadn't been in touch with. I want everyone to right now call, text, email one of those people. And I guarantee you the happiness rate will be 100%. Everyone will be so thrilled to hear from you. You've been nervous about calling. You're like, oh, they won't remember me. Of course they remember you. And of course we all came back with like this huge, endorphin boost. I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe we talked about it. So to anyone listening, go call that person, mentor, whoever it was who you hadn't talked to in a long time. And
absolutely. You'll be well worth it.
Yeah. Well, cool. Ken, this has been a lot of fun, informative. Learned a bunch. Hope had an entertaining time as well.
I did. Thank you so much for including me. I really appreciate it.
And let's stay in touch.
Yeah, for sure.